Welcome to Through the Trauma podcast. My name is Amber Larkins, published photographer, storytelling expert, visual artist, entrepreneur, speaker, and coach. This podcast was born from one question: how do I get inspiring stories of triumph out to the people who need to hear them the most? Come with me, enter my world, where lives are getting changed, heroes are getting developed, and greatness is being achieved. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Through the Trauma podcast. I am Amber, your host, and today I have with me a very special guest, Miss JenniSue Jessen. She is a survivor of human trafficking and a founder and CEO of Compass 31. She has dedicated over 25 years to combating human trafficking globally. So it's going to be a powerful conversation. Her remarkable journey from being sold into the sex trade at age 4 to becoming a key figure in shaping federal countering policies reflects her passion for justice and resilience. JenniSue, wow, I can't wait to talk to you. And thank you for sharing such an important message. I know that this is something a lot of people don't want to talk about, but I can't tell you how grateful I am that you're here to share with us today.
Thank you so much, Amber, for sharing your space with me. I absolutely believe healing happens where we can have hard conversations. And so there are some, stingy parts of my story, and there's also tremendous joy and power. So I'm excited to share all of that with you and your tribe.
These topics are really hard sometimes to discuss, and they can be triggering to people, especially people that maybe have been involved in this in some way, shape, or form. But I do warn my guests, it could be a little triggering, but also these are important topics to talk about. We were just talking before we jumped on today about how sometimes it's very easy to shove these things under the rug, like it's just not happening. But we live in a culture today where these things are happening on a much higher level. I think on a much higher level. I mean, I don't know the stats, but it seems a lot more prevalent. And with it being in the media, it seems a lot more, it's like a double-edged sword, because when it comes into the media, it becomes a little more awareness, but it also becomes a little more acceptable. Do you have thoughts about that? I know you do a lot of media. Do you think we're being talked about a little bit more? Is that a good thing, or can it raise more awareness in the sense of making it more acceptable?
I'm absolutely glad that people are willing to talk about it because, like you said, it is a hard conversation. It's uncomfortable. And all of us, nobody wants to hurt. Nobody wants to be uncomfortable. It's why we have, Tylenol for headaches, or why we binge watch a show, because we don't want to be uncomfortable. So we do anything to take us away from what is uncomfortable. And so I'm really glad that there is kind of a grassroots movement of people who are willing to enter into the mess, to get into the hard places and find the treasures in what looks on the surface to be devastating. And when you dig deep, you find just incredibly fierce individuals who have the capacity to rise from the ashes again and again and again. And people ask all the time, isn't what you do hard? And yes, I would say it's crushingly beautiful. It's also astounding to have a front row seat. And I hear the hard stories, and we're probably going to talk a little bit about my own hard story. But I also get to see the best of what the human spirit is capable of. So it's a good thing people are having conversations.
You are doing amazing work by sharing. And, it's so funny. Trauma is this thing where somebody can look at you and they would never know that you've gone through the things that you've gone through in your life. And I do want you to share a little bit of your story, because I think I can look at you and I can tell the healing and the work that it's taken for you to get here, and the amount of help that you're doing in this space to help other people overcome and raise awareness around this topic. So do you mind to share a little bit of your story?
Absolutely. Thank you. It is, one of the misconceptions that people have when I first meet them is they look at me on the surface and their first assumption is that I'm a spoiled suburban housewife, that I don't know what hard is, that I've never had to struggle just based on first interaction or first appearance. And part of that is because I live a life of purpose and joy now. So they're not seeing the shadows of where I came from. But my once upon a time starts in the Midwest, in the buckle of the Bible Belt. And at the age of 4 was the first time my grandfather sold me to another man for sex. And that first day, as you might imagine, Amber, my world turned upside down and inside out. I had no frame of reference for what was happening or why or how, or what it all meant. And the exploitation continued for 14 years. In kindergarten, I was already praying every single night that God would just let me die. I was making all kinds of promises like, I'll be good, I'll be quiet, I won't eat much, just please, please, please don't make me wake up in the morning. In first grade, I had first symptoms of a sexually transmitted infection. In second grade, I sat in a church on Sunday morning with my grandfather, my primary perpetrator, behind the man who paid to rape me the night before. I watched him after church, shaking hands with my granddad and with the pastor and holding hands with his mousy little wife, when I was still bruised and brutalized from the night before. At 9 years old, there was a particularly violent perpetrator that was unable to show up in the way that he wanted to show up for that encounter. And so he took it out on me and ended up fracturing my neck in 2 places and breaking my sacrum in 3 places. So there was just years of ongoing violence, darkness. And by the time I got to high school, my senior year in high school, I was desperate for escape and came to believe that my only solution, my only source of freedom would be through completing my own suicide. And God, in his grace and mercy, intervened so that suicide attempt failed. Obviously, here I am talking with you. The day after that suicide attempt, I found out that I was pregnant. And so I often say, God used sin to send a son that saved my life. First, his perfect son, Jesus, with grace unimaginable, but my perfectly imperfect blue eyed boy who tore his way into my world Christmas break, my freshman year in university. And with that, with the birth of this child, suddenly I had an innocent baby to protect. So it awoke in me this mama bear instinct where I had never been successful fighting back on my own behalf. When exploitation happens as a child, my grandfather was certainly psychologically far more advanced than I was as a 4-year-old. He knew how to control, he knew how to manipulate, he knew how to dominate. The few times that I did try to fight or escape, I learned really, really quickly that my survival was dependent on my silence and submission. But as a young woman, single mom with this baby, I had a mama bear instinct and finally had the courage to disclose enough information to a counselor for her to intervene and get my child and myself to safety. And that's really where my healing began, was in those, seems like a lifetime ago.
That was many years, though, that you dealt
Yeah.
with that abuse. And
Right.
this wasn't just from was your grandfather active participant in this?
He was, I guess, in the role of the pimp. He was the one exploiting me and profiting off of my exploitation. Yes, he also assaulted me regularly, and he had, like, I don't know if many of your listeners will know this, but traffickers are brilliant in money making and marketing. So he had multiple streams of revenue from my exploitation. First, he would profit just the payment received from the perpetrator to commit crimes against me. That's a nice way to say it. But during the assault, my grandfather would take pictures or videos of the crime unfolding, and then he would use those images to extort or blackmail the perpetrator so that they would keep paying for months, years later. And if or when they refused to pay the extortion fees, then my grandfather would sell those images on the black market. And so 3 streams of revenue from every single crime that was perpetrated against me over the course of 14 years, beginning at the age of 4 until just before I turned 18. So, yeah.
I'm just speechless. I'm speechless because we look at stories like this and it makes me wonder in my mind, like how many situations is going on like this right now? Because we think of trafficking. When I first started learning of sex trafficking, I thought it was coming mainly from pimps, people that would exploit women that had maybe stepped into the sex trade through dancing, or they were had a boyfriend that would extort them or whatever.
Right.
Or people get kidnapped, which
Right.
we don't hear about a lot, but it happens a lot. When you look at the statistics, it happens a lot. However, I had another lady come on and share on the podcast too, that a lot of times that's really not when a sex trafficker is going to kidnap a kid. A lot of times it's the kids that already are troubled. They don't have a good upbringing. They really don't have a good family stability. So from a year and a half of doing this podcast and just talking to different people, I've seen that sex trafficking doesn't look always like we think it looks like, or at least it didn't how I thought it looked initially.
Yeah.
But when I hear stories like yours and like some of the other stories that I've heard, I'm just blown away, because these are things that could literally be happening next door.
Absolutely.
We don't even know.
I guarantee you they are happening in your city. They're happening all around us, unfortunately. And it goes unseen. And it goes unseen for a couple of reasons. One, as a culture, we've gotten so busy. We're just scurrying or scrolling through our lives. I have to get from point A to point B. I have to pick up the kids. I have to make dinner. We've got soccer practice. We've got work. We got blah, 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 blah. And any moment that we pause, we tend to sink in and scroll through our phones, and we are not seeing what's happening all around us. But trafficking is really, really prevalent in every state in the US, in every city. And I would venture a guess in a large number of browser histories in every family's household, people who are searching for content that is explicit. There's no way to verify what they're viewing on the screen, whether it was filmed consensually or through force, fraud, or coercion. And you did mention kidnapping, and yes, kidnapping happens, but our view of trafficking is very much that Hollywood, Liam Neeson or Jim Caviezel kicks down the door and rescues the kid. And kidnapping does happen, but it's such a small minority of the cases. Over 76% of individuals that are trafficked are originally or first exploited by somebody they love, either a family member or a romantic partner. And I mean, that's a huge number. That leaves 24% of other. And most of the other are through fraudulent job offers. Somebody's offered a modeling contract. Somebody's offered a job in hospitality, or even creating content online, but not understanding or being completely deceived as to what they're actually going to. And the reason for that is if you kidnap a kid, the whole community is going to turn out with posters of this missing kid. Law enforcement's going to get involved, churches are going to get involved, they're going to be walking the neighborhoods, and that creates a tremendous amount of risk for the traffickers. But if the trafficker can build a relationship with an individual in person or online, and this is happening dramatically with our kids these days, online, they're gaming with people online that they think, I'm a 15-year-old kid, I'm playing with another 15-year-old kid. I hate my parents. They're mouthing about whatever they're frustrated about, thinking they're playing with another 15-year-old kid. Hey, let's go hang out at the mall. They meet at the mall, but they're really encountering a 60-year-old perpetrator, convicted sex offender. And so it doesn't look like what we tend to think it looks like. I came from an upper middle class family in a small town in nowhere, Missouri. Like for kindergarten, I got a fur coat and my own color TV in 1977 for Christmas from Santa Claus. So it wasn't what we think of stereotypically. It was my grandfather, who was a wicked bad guy and very strategic in how he could exploit my vulnerability for his profit.
Did you live with him?
I did part of the time. The follow-up question that I bet you're going to ask, I get all the time, is where were your parents? And when I tell my story, I generally leave them out of it because they were functionally absent. My dad was an alcoholic. My mom was addicted to my dad. So there was a lot of upheaval or crisis in my house regularly. And I believe my parents really, truly, I think, were doing what they believed was best. That when my household was in crisis, they would send me 3 hours away to stay with my grandparents. And that could be for a couple of days to a few months at a time. And that 3 hour distance between home and what should have been safe, my household and my grandfather, was enough of a buffer for him to have access and make sure injuries are healed before I went home again and keep what was happening a secret.
Where was your grandmother? Did she know? Was she aware of this?
My grandmother did know what was happening, and she preferred silence. She loved her lifestyle, and she came from poverty during the Great Depression and always had security issues around money. So even though they were really wealthy comparatively in a small town, big fish in a little pond, she loved her lifestyle, and you don't talk about things like that. So she did know what was happening. There was one particular encounter that she took me school clothes shopping and came in the dressing room and saw bruises up and down my thighs. And she kind of froze in her tracks and eyes got big. And she took a deep breath and she said, "We will never speak of this," and turned around and walked out. And then years later, when the truth came out and I actually confronted my grandparents with, all of these things that happened, my grandmother just sat in her chair, nodding her head and crying the whole time. But then at the end, she said, "Well, it's not incest because you're not blood," because he was a grandfather by marriage, not by blood. And that was her defense. That's how she rationalized not intervening for the 14 years that I was being exploited.
I have so many thoughts going through my mind. This is heartbreaking. Like your story is heartbreaking to me. Because, well, for so many reasons. One, I think home is supposed to be a place for children to feel safe. And it's heartbreaking to me as I hear so many stories of abuse, not just sexual abuse, but just any kind of abuse. Although sexual abuse, to me, I feel like is horrible. It's horrible. because it robs you of your innocence. It robs you of your vulnerability, your ability to trust. It robs you of like so many things in your life. As a kid, you don't even know how to navigate this or put this into words. Like,
Right.
you're learning who you are, and that's hard enough for a kid that goes through life with a great upbringing. It's really hard to navigate who you are when you get into
Right.
those teenage years. And now you're having to navigate through this kind of trauma that nobody really can understand. And you grew up in a generation, my generation, same, where it's not talked about. There was not platforms like this. That it's so hush hush. So it's like, did you ever feel like you were completely alone? Like there was no one that could truly understand?
Absolutely. I mean, I believed my experience was unique. There was a handful of other children that I was exploited with, but beyond that, well, I guess I would have a two-part answer to that. One, I felt alone in the aspect of I believed no help is coming. Like my grandmother knew, she didn't intervene. There were instances that my mom should have known, she did not intervene. People that I was exploited by or abused by, I was abused by a police officer, a judge, a business owner, old men, young men, men in the church. So I felt desperately alone in that I didn't think that there was help or relief or release anywhere. But the other piece of that is I also didn't recognize that this wasn't what everybody went through. That my other 6-year-old friends and 7-year-old friends and 8-year-old friends weren't enduring the same thing. This was what was normal in my life. I didn't have a frame of reference for what a childhood minus exploitation could or would be. So I don't know if that makes sense, but yes, I felt wildly alone and also didn't recognize that the violence was different than what anybody else endured.
So it wasn't until you were like 18 that you really come to the realization that this is over. I'm not being exploited anymore. And now you can start to heal from that.
Yes.
Take me through a little bit of that journey.
You know, Amber, I was rascally. I came by healing, like clawing my way out of the grave. It was not pretty. I would not have been a likable or lovable person my college years. For a couple of reasons. During my journey of exploitation, I had been invited to church when I was 14, and it was a beautiful church, and it was a good experience, and I prayed and received Christ as my savior at the age of 14. But my exploitation continued. And so my teenage years, I had this deep, hard wrestling of, wait a minute, I gave my life to God and this is still happening. So either God is all good and he's weak, like he hates what's happening to me, but he's powerless to stop it, or God's all powerful and he could stop it, but he doesn't care to. And I couldn't reconcile the two. And so when I first came to freedom, in university, I double majored in biology and world religion because I was determined to find the capital T truth. Even though I had been involved in the church, I had also been exploited in the church. And so what is capital T truth? And I would argue that Holy Spirit, with great tenderness and mercy, kept bringing me back to the Bible because I thought I was going to disprove it. And instead, I encountered Jesus in some really profound ways. And that's where my freedom really shifted. I was invited by a pastor. Our whole congregation was invited to memorize the book of Ephesians. And for me, growing up, school was my safe place. Like if school was in session, I was in school. I was not being exploited. I was the teacher's pet. I loved school. So if you give me an assignment, I'm going to get the gold star. So invited to memorize Ephesians, and I did not get very far before everything that turned upside down when I was 4 began to right itself. Because Ephesians 1:4 says this, "For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us to be adopted as his own." And I was like, oh, wait. He chose me before the creation of the world, the eternal one, outside of time, looked throughout history and went like, no, that one, JenniSue, she's mine. She's holy. She's blameless. That's like before he separated the light from the darkness, before he flipped on the lights, before he separated the sea from the land. He chose us in him. And so as I wrestled with that, Jesus brought back the memory of that first encounter when I was 4 years old. And after the unthinkable had happened, my grandfather wrapped me in a blanket, put me in the backseat of the car to take me home. And my grandfather, besides his perverse love for little girls, loved old gospel music. And so he put in a cassette tape playing "How Great Thou Art." And over the years of my exploitation, he actually used that as a terrorist tactic. He played "How Great Thou Art" on repeat, either during the violence or immediately after the violence, as a way of programming me to never find freedom, never find faith. But as I was wrestling through the implications of Ephesians 1:4, he chose us in him before the creation of the world. Jesus brought me back to that memory, the backseat of the car, this snot dripping, crying, bloody mess, watching a sunset out the window, unable to reconcile the violence that had just happened. And Jesus gave me this very clear image of him sitting in the backseat of the car, holding me on his lap. And he didn't mind the tears. He didn't mind the snot. He didn't mind the blood, just with such tenderness, holding me and whispering, "I've got you, baby. I'm not going to let you go." And in reality, he never did. He in like fast forward mode, he showed me all these scenes of violence over 14 years and showed me he was here and he was here and he was here and he was here. And that he proved his goodness and his power because he didn't abandon me in it. Like, did the violence happen? Yes. Do I have the physical damage? Absolutely. But he kept me whole. Like, my soul is whole. The part of me that has risen from the grave is made in the image of God, is made in the image of the divine. And that was the proof of his goodness and his power, that he could be all loving, that he could be all powerful, because even in the most unthinkable, unspeakable violence, he never left me for a moment. He brought me through it. And so that's how, in my rascally college days trying to disprove God, he brought me through and to an understanding of the tenderness and the rage he felt at the violence I was enduring.
Mm. Yeah, I've had people ask me before, like, how is it that if God is all powerful, he can allow such evil into the world? And my thoughts, I'd love to know yours. My thoughts are, he says in the Bible, we live in a fallen world. It has, Satan runs through the earth seeking who he may devour. And so, and he's working through people. And I'm even starting to wonder if everyone we see is truly human. Like, I don't know that there's not spiritual forces like operating in the form of humans. But
Right.
that's a whole nother, that's going down the rabbit hole. We won't go into that.
That's a whole different rabbit hole. And, the book of Hebrews says we will entertain angels unaware, so I don't think it's so far-fetched. I think it's a whole nother conversation. But there is evil in the world. And, darkness is just the absence of the light, right? So God exists, love exists, hate is the absence of that. Darkness is the absence of where we reject God's presence, we reject his mercy, we reject his love. And really we're all human. We're driven by greed and lust often. And he allows us to suffer the consequences of that when we choose our own way and we're willing to exploit others to get our own way. There's a lot of darkness in the world. And still, I would argue that his mercy keeps chasing us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where he's God and I'm not. There's a lot of people I would have given up on, right? But his mercy's new every morning.
Well, and we have to also, I mean, there's degrees of trauma. There's different degrees of the different trauma that we've been through. But realistically, almost everyone's gone through some type of trauma. People don't always want to talk about it. People want to stuff it. They don't want to face it. And that's one of the purposes that I have for this podcast, is just like healing and wholeness. And I want to interview people like you who promoting healing and wholeness in the most horrific situations, because there is hope, and stuffing it is not always the answer. But we all, as our human experience here on earth, we are going to experience some type of trauma. And but the Bible does also say God uses all things for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And I do believe, I've clung to that verse a lot in my own life, but it's like the things that have happened in my life, or that has happened in anyone's life, God can in fact use those for good. And not that he condones the violence or the things that have happened, but but now that it's happened, he can transmutate that into something good. And we see that you're a living example of this, because now you're helping other people. You're advocating, you're fighting the fight against it and raising awareness against it. And I think that that's a true representation of, God, as he kept you strong, even through not to say you didn't have moments of weakness, but he kept you strong through those hardships. And now he's using you in a powerful way.
Yeah, I would say it's all God's grace. Absolutely. Because, there were definitely instances in my childhood that I shouldn't have survived it. If I had my way when I was 17, I wouldn't have survived it. I tried and failed to complete my suicide. So I would say the fact that I'm here and transformed and having an impact in the world are the result of his mercy. But you're definitely touching on one of my passion points, and that is, I don't believe that we are defined by trauma. I believe that we are equipped by it. And that every experience we go through and come out the other side empowers us to walk alongside other people who are suffering, whether they have a whole series of little t traumas or they have a handful of capital T traumas. The reality is all of us are navigating this dark, chaotic world. And when I get to sit with someone and they hear my story and see that I'm on the other side of it, it awakens in them this hope of possibility of, well, if she can survive that, then maybe I can survive this. If she can move to a place of impact, maybe I can move to a place of impact. And that's why I love my life and love what I do, because I get to see people rise all the time, rise to their capacity, rise to the fullness of who they were created to be before the trauma happened, and taking all those treasures of darkness and displaying them in a world that shines light and brings hope for healing.
You had talked about how your grandfather sold these pictures. And I don't know if you're aware of this. I've actually done a little bit of research on this. of how Pornhub takes exploited victims and
Yep.
sells their, it's story after story. When you go digging down this rabbit hole, there's story after
Yeah, it's
story of
bad.
women. It's so bad. And I even venture to say that if the viewers, people who are watching this stuff, that it's presented to us in this package of like, oh, pornography, just watch it. It's kind of like it's extracurricular kind
It's
of things that you can do.
everybody
But
does it. Just fun. It's just pretend. It's not hurting anybody.
but it's horrific. Like when you read the
Yeah.
stories and you look at and a lot of the people that are exploited there are they have come in, like you said earlier, through a job, modeling job, and then they get
Right.
exploited, or they are trafficked and they're getting exploited, or they're being drugged and then they're being exploited, or they're being blackmailed
Right.
and they're being exploited. So this is a real issue. And I've read that the sex industry is, don't, I can't quote this exactly, but it's like one of the highest paid, like above even like the drug industry. Like bringing drugs in is like sex trafficking supersedes that.
Right.
And it's disheartening because how many people are being affected by this? And then how many people turn their heads the opposite way? Like it's
Right.
not even happening.
Right.
So this begs the question, what do we do? Like
Yeah.
what can we do to fix it? Obviously it's not an overnight fix. It's something that it raises a lot of questions. Like as an individual, what can I do? As a community, what can we do? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. You're touching on a point I kind of alluded to early in our conversation, that there are individuals being trafficked all around us, including in the hidden browser histories of the computers in most households. Of, if anybody in the household is searching for illicit content, they are encountering people who are being exploited at some point. And so it is happening all around us. Pornography is absolutely the marketing department for sex trafficking. They are intrinsically linked. You cannot unmix the Play-Doh. They're intrinsically connected to one another. And even if there's content that is being made consensually, the demand for any kind of content, there's not enough of willing creators to create it. So if somebody searches a particular keyword, they immediately are given 1,000 videos to meet that demand. But there's not 1,000 content creators who at 10 years old were dreaming, I'm going to grow up and be a porn star. Right. And so the industry is going to meet the demand. When people are searching certain things, there may be a few people who are willingly creating that content, but to meet the demand requires force, fraud, or coercion to manipulate and exploit vulnerabilities, individuals, and force them to create that content. So it's all intrinsically linked. And I know you know this, Amber. Like you said, you've been down the rabbit hole. Some of your listeners may or may not have connected those dots. The other piece I would like to add to that, and then I'll answer your question about how do we disrupt it, is that when we talk about the sex trade, whether it's pornography or prostitution, in our culture, we still accept that prostitution is illegal almost everywhere in the US. There's a few districts that it's not, but almost everywhere prostitution is illegal. Prostitution is the exchange of money or something of value in exchange for sex, right? Just basic definition. I would argue that you cannot pay for sex. The buyer is paying the individual to waive their consent. because once money exchanges hands, the individual is obligated to do whatever the buyer wants. Now, would she or he be having sex with this guy if they weren't being paid? If the answer is no, then what they've done is they've waived their consent. The person is paid for them to waive their consent, which means it's non-consensual sex, which means it's assault across the board. The only difference between prostitution and pornography is that that transaction is happening with a film crew. Okay, so somebody's being paid for sex, and suddenly it's no longer illegal because somebody's filming it. Like, how does that work? So anytime we're viewing pornography, we're actually viewing crime scene photos or crime scene images. That's just the reality that we tend to try to justify or brush away as if it's nothing important or not significant. Now, I would argue that the solution may seem ridiculous, but I'm going to say it because you asked me my opinion. Mm-hmm. Is that we slow down to the speed of love. And here's what I mean by that. That I put down my phone and I take a deep breath and I create more margin in my life, that I'm not always scrolling or scurrying from point A to point B. And I see the people around me that are hurting. Whether it's, the mom at the grocery store whose kid's melting down, or the woman at the bank behind me who has a black eye, or the sullen teenager hiding behind black makeup and a hood, that I see the people around me and that I'm willing to have hard conversations. I'm willing to say, well, I don't even view them as hard conversations anymore. Messy, maybe. But I'm willing to say, hey, are you okay? Like, how can I serve you today? How can I love you today? What do you need? What brings you joy? When was the last time you laughed until you cried? When I engage people around me who are hurting, then the walls come down and they will disclose to you when you've gained their trust, like, you know what, my granddad's a really bad guy and I don't know what to do about it. Or my boyfriend beat me up last night, but I don't have anywhere to go. He took my keys, he took my money. I don't, when we're willing to see people around us, then we disrupt the ongoing trauma. And the reason I use those examples is because trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum. The vast majority of people who end up trafficked were originally sexually abused or assaulted as children. And so they were groomed. They grew up that this is normal. This is what life is. At some point, they may choose to enter into the sex trade consensually, as they're trying to regain their power, figure out where they stand in the world, thinking, I get to choose who, when, where, why, how much. And in the beginning, that can feel wildly empowering. But if we can meet those individuals with compassion, like, I see you and you're worth more than this. Whatever they're paying is not enough for who you are. You are walking divine. You are made in the image of God, and you can't put a price on that. Then that's where we disrupt it. And when we start seeing people, I would say, made in the image of God, then it makes it really, really complicated and challenging to view them as objects in our spare time and use them for our own gratification. And so that disrupts when we have healthy relationships in our families, between parents and kids, between spouses, between community members, then exploitation goes way, way down because there's no demand for it and there's no allowance for it. But in communities where we're disconnected and families that are dysfunctional, then it thrives. It thrives in all of those disconnections because trafficking is always an exploitation of vulnerability.
That's a great, great place to start, because hearing you talk, like, it sets my heart like on fire, like in anger, like that this is actually happening. And like, it makes me want to go and fight. Like, I'm
Yeah.
just being honest. It makes me want to, like, what can I do? I'm ready to just go rescue some kids.
Right.
But if you, it's not that easy because you don't know what's going on right under your nose. And
Right.
sometimes you have to fight that violence with love. And I think that's a great explanation from somebody who, yourself, who has a gigantic heart for seeing people not only overcome this but thrive on the other side of it, and raising a huge awareness about it. I will say this, like, I learned of something, and again, this kind of goes back to when we first got on the podcast, and I said, how do we keep people from misusing this information? And I feel like, it's like there are bad people in the world, and
There
it's
are.
like scary sometimes to release certain information because then it gives them ideas. They're like, oh, well, maybe I could do this too.
Right.
And as evil continues to excel in the world that we live in, um,
Hmm.
it's really sad. And I was listening to something this past week, and I won't get into the details because I don't want people going to look it up, and I don't want people like seeing it.
Yeah.
I was horrified. But it's a public platform, and it's hidden. It's a platform that we all know, very well known platform, and it's hidden. On one
Mm.
account, this was some of the most horrific porn, and it's right there. It's a platform that my kids have been on, they've looked on.
Yep.
So it's right there for them to see it.
Yep.
And I'm just horrified that these kinds of things are not only, they're becoming more and more acceptable. And when you look at porn,
Hmm.
it's highly addictive, and it's rewiring the brain. Once you start watching one level of porn, that's not enough. And then you got
Right.
mainstream media that's normalizing certain things, and that's not enough. I don't know all the answers. I don't. This is why I like having people like yourself on here that comes on and shares your thoughts and opinions. But I know that it makes me so angry, um,
Mm.
because people are being abused by it. People are being
Right.
exploited by it. And that feeling of feeling like there's no way out except death, that's a really dark and lonely place to be. And I don't want
Yeah.
anyone to ever feel like that. It's part of the reason I do this podcast. I don't want people to feel that way. I've been there. I know what that feels like.
There is a large percentage of individuals who've been exploited in the sex trade that report that they believe their only way of escape is death. Like they're going to be there until they die or complete their suicide. That's how that there is no hope for freedom outside of the life that they have known to that point. And it's devastatingly sad. And it's happening all around us, and we go through our lives with blinders on, unaware of what's happening. Or even if we are aware, we're afraid to engage and enter in. And I would guess probably a large portion of your audience, anybody that has kids, if you have a birthday party at your house and there's 15 kids there, I always tell parents to go around the room just mentally, not outside, but just for an example, to look around the room and go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, these 5 kids, 5 out of this group of 15 will be sexually assaulted by the time they're 18. And that is an entry point. That is a vulnerability that ushers people into sexual exploitation. And so to know if you have a birthday party of 9-year-olds and there's 15 of them, to take a deep breath while they're blowing out the candles and open presents and go, "Oh my gosh, 5 of these children are going to be raped by the time they're 18. What am I going to do about that?" Well, if we want to disrupt trafficking, that's what I mean. Slow down to the speed of love. Like you have that birthday party and I see you to every single kid. every single kid and parents that are at the birthday party, like to communicate with your eyes, with your heart, with your language. Your soul is safe with me. When people feel seen, then they are able to disclose and they're able to move towards safety. Because what's been happening to them in the dark, in the silence, happens because it's in the dark and in silence. And so that's a really powerful exercise to do. Our church was recently hosting a VBS, and I was helping train some of the staff, and I told them the same thing. Like, when we're all in the group session and there's 300 kids in here, look at 1/3 of them are going to be assaulted before they're 18. Is what we are giving them this week going to be enough to get them through whatever's coming for them? And if not, how do we do better? So I think that's an uncomfortable and challenging and beautiful solution that any concerned citizen, any average Joe, can disrupt trafficking and trauma that's happening around us.
Yeah. And I wish more leaders in the church, leaders in the school, leaders in just day-to-day life, like would hear that. I hope that this episode gets a lot of views, and I hope that people resonate with that, what you just said. Because as adults, you're right, we get busy. It's out of sight, out of mind. And what we're around begins to feel normal. Like you said, I was a kid. I thought this was normal. Well, I feel like, I mean, every house comes with its issues, right? Like, but I feel like relatively, like my house I provide a safe place for my kids. So it's very easy for me to feel like that's normal. What I'm trying to say is it doesn't matter on where you're at. Like, what we tend to be around seems to paint the picture of normalcy. So if you are in a very healthy spot, we disregard it because it feels like what's normal is healthy. If we're in a very toxic place, it feels like that's normal. So,
which is exactly one of the primary problems with pornography, right? If an individual is regularly engaging with pornography, their default becomes this is normal, not just viewing pornography and engaging with it, but that what they're seeing on the screen is a normal expectation of what sex is or is not, right? And when that becomes our normal, our frame of reference for what's normal, then the way we engage in the world is really dangerous. It's not beneficial for the person viewing it or how they're engaging in the world, the people who are receiving that pornified view of the world.
Yeah, you're right. It's, so hopefully this episode brings a lot of awareness around these things. And I hope that it will inspire and encourage people to pay attention to what's around them and just to look for those things. Our intuition has been blinded by a lot of the electronics and things that we're on. But if we can bring that intuition, our intuition will tell us, I believe. When someone's struggling.
Yeah.
But I know we're getting really close to that hour point. I do want you to tell everyone kind of where to find you, how they can follow you, how they can be engaged with you, how they can learn about and hop on board with some of the things that you're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you for that invitation. People can find me online. I'm JenniSue Jessen. Our organization is Compass 31. And so our website is that COMPASS31.org, compass31.org. And that's my primary platform. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, Compass 31, JenniSue Jessen, LinkedIn. You can find me all of those places. They can send me DMs or email me through the website. I would love to have follow-up conversations. And I would say, key takeaway is that trauma doesn't define us, it equips us to create a more just world. That's what I'm most passionate about. That healing is not only possible, but with the right support, it's entirely probable. And the answer to fighting human trafficking is you and me doing it together. And trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's a relational crime. It's happening between multiple people. And I would argue that the antidote is the same. Healing happens in community. Healing is relational. So I would just invite your listeners to connect with me. Let's build a relationship. Let's be friends. Let's join arms and take a stand. And instead of all the dark, my perspective has changed from what I'm fighting against pornography, against exploitation, against violence, which is good. But, Amber, if I'm swinging my sword at the dark, all I'm seeing is the dark. And it's like trying to empty the ocean with a thimble. Like there's an ocean ahead of me. But instead, I shifted a couple of years ago to what I'm fighting for. And I'm fighting for a more just world. I'm fighting for love. I'm fighting for redemption. I'm fighting for healing. And with that perspective, the outcome's the same. But the perspective and the day-to-day experience is totally different, because now I'm like holding my sword, charging toward the light, going, come on, baby, this is the way we're going. And it's an entirely different experience. So I would love for your community to connect with me at compass31.org, Facebook, Instagram, wherever. And yeah, let's do this thing. Let's slow down and see the people that are really in front of us and intervene in strategic and significant ways and watch freedom unfold.
I really praise God for everything that you're doing. I really do. You're a strong, very strong person. Obviously, God has given you the strength to fight this fight and aligned you with the right people to fight it with. And I really applaud you for everything that you're doing and for sharing the difficult topics that is really hard to share. But thank you for coming on today and sharing with my listeners. That means the world to me.
I'm so grateful. Like I said, as a child, I learned my survival was dependent on silence and submission. And it has been a lifetime unlearning that. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, for offering me space to reclaim my voice and my power. And I hope that it inspires hope in your audience as well.
Thank you for listening to Through the Trauma podcast. If you have found value in this episode or believe in the mission behind what we are doing, please subscribe so that you never miss any future episodes. Also, be sure to check out our transformation project at transformationthroughtraumaproject.com, where we help inspirational stories get heard on a larger scale through multiple platforms. If you know someone who can benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Until next time.